It's all very well having a lovely display in your foyer when you walk into your office of having the values up there. And they've been wordsmithed by some excellent marketeers, probably like yourself, Toby. But you need to really be working with the employees, that, the people on the ground, to bring this kind of bottom-up approach to establishing what the values are and getting that buy-in.
Hi, I'm Toby Brown, Head of Marketing at Interaction, and this is Thrivalism, our podcast about all things workplace. And talking of workplaces, creating a healthy, high-performing one is difficult. Creating a healthy, high-performing workplace while navigating the changes brought by COVID-19 and establishing new ways of working, while also dealing with seismic organisational change, is even more difficult. So, in this episode, I'm delighted to welcome Director of Babel Projects, work psychologist, employee wellbeing consultant, HR and change expert, Jennifer Duckworth. Jennifer, hello.
Hello. Hi, Toby.
Hi, lovely to have you on. I'd like to talk about all of that stuff with you. I'd like to talk about how businesses can build in the resilience they need to manage change, what organisations need to be thinking about when it comes to employee wellness, and how to keep your workplace culture robust in quite turbulent times. That's a lot of stuff and a big subject. So maybe we start with you. Do you want to tell us a bit about how you ended up being an expert in all these areas? What sort of piqued your interest at an earlier age?
Okay, yeah, great. Thank you. Well, yeah, I'm a work psychologist now, but prior to that, I worked in HR. So I had a corporate HR role for many years. My first degree was in psychology, so I was always interested in psychology. And then from that, I went straight into corporate world, working with people and teams. It was really generalist role, so I did all sorts of different things. But the area I was particularly keen on and interested in was really understanding what made people tick, how you could get the best out of people, how you could train managers and train individuals to help them be great at their jobs and love their jobs. And then also create a culture around that where people could really enjoy work, have fun there and thrive. And so those were the areas within HR that I really liked. And then when I left those roles, I did a master's in occupational and business psychology, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I've had lots of practice saying that one. And since then, I've been working as an independent consultant. So using that HR background and then the real kind of the grounding in the evidence and the research that I learned through the MSc, to work with organisations independently, helping them understand how they can build happier workforces where their people can really thrive.
And with that skill set and that focus, I imagine it's been a busy few years for you recently. Yes, it has. It has. There's been I've had lots of different projects and lots of different clients working on a variety of things, actually. So some days I might be, we talked about you mentioned resilience earlier. So some days I might be working with teams running training courses or programs to help them understand the factors that feed into resilience and how they can really improve that in the workplace. Other days I might be working on HR projects. So, for example, helping individual companies look at their values, establish what their values are, and really understand the behaviours that drive their values, and get everybody, kind of singing from the same hymn sheet. And I also work on change management projects as well, which I think is one of the things we're going to cover today. So obviously there's been huge amounts of change recently. The change management stuff probably sits at the top of that tree because that's quite a broad subject, isn't it? So when organisations are beginning that process, what are some of the common challenges they encounter? What's the stuff they need to be thinking about to create sort of successful and sustainable change?
I think the first thing they need to be thinking about with change is that it will be particularly challenging at the moment because people have had such a long time, really, of constant levels of uncertainty. And I think the thing that people fear about change is the uncertainty that it brings. Change would be straightforward if we all knew what was around the corner, because we're programmed psychologically to be concerned and fear change. Because from our caveman days, if there was something different in our environment, then our senses would be on red alert and we would be scared. And that would be good because that would protect us from getting killed by a saber-toothed tiger or a dinosaur. But nowadays, I think, though, what businesses can do is to really help people understand why they're bringing in a change that they're bringing in. So what's the reason behind it and how it really aligns with organizational values and goals. I think it's about getting leadership teams really behind the change and endorsing it, because I've seen many change projects fail because, the middle managers or the HR teams really believe in the change. But if the senior leaders aren't really endorsing it and walking the talk, then it's very unlikely that things are going to land, because, you'll look at your role models in that business or the people that are influential before you really make the change yourself. Those are a couple of the first things I guess I would think about.
And you touched on the role of sort of values, organizational values in that change process. And that's something that I'm really interested in. And I think it feels like all organizations try and pin down their values at some point. Not many of them feel like they do it authentically and successfully. And certainly not many of them feel like those values really filter down to everybody in there, sort of form a collective experience. So and that's just a statement, it's not a question, but what are some of the things that people need to bear in mind when creating their values? What are some pitfalls you find? And what are some things to be aware of when you're trying to build and integrate values throughout an organisation?
Okay, I think one of the key things to think about with organisational values is you need to be able to bring them to life for individuals. So it's all very well having a lovely display in your foyer when you walk into your office of having the values up there. And they've been wordsmithed by some excellent marketeers, probably like yourself, Toby. But you need to really be working with the employees, the people on the ground, to bring this kind of bottom-up approach to establishing what the values are and getting that buy-in. So pieces of work that I've done recently on values, actually, it was with a reasonably small company, which made it, I guess, a bit easier to be able to connect with everyone and get them involved. But that can work just as well with large teams. You just have a longer process or program to allow people to get involved, either through focus groups or through surveys or different ways of working with people to help them define the values, agree them across the board. And then the final stage that I think maybe some companies maybe forget is working out what the behaviors are. So what will we be doing on a day-to-day basis that shows us that we're living this value? And equally, what are the things that show that we aren't living this value? And are we going to be brave enough to call each other out on that if we're not living and breathing those values?
Yeah, a bit of stick and carrot to try and get them to run through the organisation. When you build those values from the bottom up, isn't there a danger sometimes that you end up with really generic ones that sound the same across loads of different businesses? They're like, we value inclusivity and freedom and animal rights, or whatever those three values might be. But how do you steer away from values that end up being quite generic?
I think it's about working out what's important to that population within that organisation. And as long as you're asking the right questions when you're talking to the employees, they shouldn't be coming up with things like that. You don't ask them, what are the values? You ask them, what are the great things about working here? Or you ask them, what is it about this company or this business that you really love? Or what makes us a brilliant team? And then you figure out what those values are later. The way I do it is you end up with loads and loads of Post-it notes all over the wall because you've got loads and loads and loads of ideas. And then you start to theme them. And then at that point, that's when the values start to come out.
Start to form into themes and
start to form into themes, and then you create the values out of those.
And you mentioned earlier about people resisting change on a sort of fundamental level because it's the status quo is safe. Is there anything you can do on an individual level to help people navigate that change from an organisational perspective? So are there granular things that organisations and businesses can do to help people fear that change less?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was saying earlier, any anxiety around change, and then that's where the resistance comes in, will be from this fear of uncertainty and a lack of control as well. So I think one of the key psychological needs that we have is autonomy or a sense of control. So if you can, first of all, give employees the rationale behind the change, as I said earlier, and the consequences of not changing and what it means for them on an individual level as well. So, being able to communicate not only about the organisation and why they're making the change, but what that means for the individual as well. And hopefully there'll be lots of benefits to the change as well. There might be some things that are lost that the person will be sad about. And that's another reason actually that people can be concerned about change, because it's a loss. People talk about the change curve, which you may have heard of, the kind of classic change curve that we talk about, the different emotions that we go through when we're going through change. That's actually based on a grief process. So you're going through grief, you're going through a loss for what was happening before, and then moving into a new way of being or way of working.
So what are the phases on that change curve?
What are they?
What are the stages of that change curve? Yeah.
So you've got shock at the beginning. So you're surprised or you're shocked at what's going to happen next, or you might be quite surprised about how it's communicated. Often then you get denial. And people can move through these stages very quickly, or they can move through them slowly. So everybody will be different. So that's another challenge for organizations, is people aren't robots. They won't be doing everything at the same time. Shock, then denial, then a kind of frustration or a recognition that things are different. Sometimes people can that's where the fear comes in, and maybe anger as well. And a lower level of the curve is a kind of, it's called depression. So you can get a low mood or lacking in energy as you come through the change. And then the curve comes up the other side, and the stages are experiment, which is where people start to initially engage with the new situation. And then decision, kind of learning how to work in new situations and feeling more positive about these things. And then finally, integration. So that's when changes are integrated, and you get an individual who's kind of ready to move on, and they're adapting to that change and kind of rebuilding what their reality is.
Amazing. I hadn't heard of that, so thanks. That's really interesting.
Okay.
Obviously, all that stuff has got really big impacts on stress levels, anxiety, wellness, those sort of things. And you do quite a lot of work in that field as well. What do companies... how do you even begin to approach making sure everybody's wellness stays at sort of respectable levels throughout a change process? What are the beginning steps there?
Yeah, I think really, thinking about wellness. It's great at the moment because wellbeing is really kind of rising up the agenda. So workplaces are really thinking about that at the same time. And wellbeing does go hand in hand with change. So a lot of the things that you would be putting in place to ensure that a change process works effectively and successfully and brings everyone with you are the same kind of things that support well-being. So I often say to people, think about there's three very distinct psychological needs that we have, and they will be the same regardless of where we're working, what change we're going through. We're always going to have these deep-rooted needs. And it's quite handy that you can remember them with A, B, C. So A is the autonomy that I mentioned earlier. So having some sense of control over the change, or indeed over our own situation, will give us a stronger sense of well-being and will be good for our mental health. So you've got the A, you've got the autonomy. And then that will flow through in change programs by making sure you've got people involved, or giving them the opportunity to be involved and give upward feedback into the organisation about how they're feeling or what their motivations are or what they're looking for from the change. So that some level of autonomy. B is for belonging. So that is all about being supported socially and having that sense of belonging within the organisation. So that's where all the good stuff comes in around creating a culture where you're really supporting each other and you've got strong relationships and a sense of connection with the organisation and with each other. And then the C is for competence. So that is all about us feeling like what we're doing at work and in our lives is meaningful. We've kind of got clarity around it. We've got meaning, we've got purpose, and we're also being good at something or being good enough at something and getting stuff done. So that sense of some level of competence is really important. So those three things all together.
Going back to the belonging element of that, one of the blogs that you wrote that I read had a really interesting point about focusing on the weak ties of relationships. And that's not something that I've given much thought to until I read it, and then it made total sense. So could you just talk me through what you mean by that?
Yes, it's really fascinating, isn't it? There's some really key pieces of research about focusing on the weak ties versus the strong ties. And a lot has been written about this quite recently because of the move to working remotely, obviously through the pandemic, And then many companies coming back into a kind of hybrid situation, making sure that they have people focusing on these weak ties as well as the strong ties. So strong ties are our friends, family, and colleagues at work that we work with day in, day out. And we've probably got a pretty strong relationship with them. We're probably friends with them. We probably do social stuff with them, and we know them quite well. And those connections are really important. But psychologists used to think that those were the only important ones, that those are the ones that really mattered. But actually, the weaker ties, which are the more informal connections that we have with people, either in life. So, if you're walking down to the station every day and you get a coffee from the same little coffee shop before you get on the train, when you're talking to the barista in there, that's one of your weaker ties. So you don't have a really deep relationship with them, but it's somebody that is in your network and that you're social with, that you see every day, or reasonably regularly. And so in the workplace, these weaker ties are the people that you would bump into in the lift or in the kitchen, or these kind of water cooler moments that lots has been written about recently, because it's really hard to recreate them through a Zoom chat or through a Teams meeting. And so organisations are really struggling with how do we make sure these weaker ties are important.
And why are those weak ties so important? Like, is that on an individual level for people's well-being, or is that on an organisational level for the way the business functions?
They're important because we get lots more information and ideas from people that aren't in our very close network. So if you think about the people that you hang out with all the time, or your friends or family, more than likely you're going to have perhaps similar kinds of opinions, similar kinds of interests, not always, but you might be fishing in that same pool, that ideas pool, if you like. Whereas when we connect with people outside of that circle, that inner circle, that's where ideas come from. That's where innovation and creativity comes from, and so new information and new opportunities. And so in a work setting, there's often talk about how creativity can be sparked by these water cooler moments, because you're talking to people outside of your regular group.
So that's really interesting. I really like that idea as well. Even on a fundamental level, when you have a little walk down the street and you bump into a couple of people you vaguely know and you have a nice small interaction with them, it still leaves you feeling quite uplifted and energized with a different perspective on stuff. Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense to me. That's really nice.
Yeah.
And I guess another thing that comes into that then is you just touched on hybrid working there and remote working. And what lots of people are struggling with at the moment is how to maintain their culture and not dilute it, and keep people feeling connected and not isolated when they've got hybrid working. And it's a really difficult subject, isn't it? Because every organisation is different, all the workforces are different. What are some granular things you advise people to do when trying to consider how to keep everyone connected and culture unified?
Yeah, you're right. It's a really big kind of concern at the moment, and people are kind of wanting to retain some of the convenience and flexibility around home working, whilst at the same time not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, not losing the level of connection that you get when you're face-to-face in the office. So the kind of what I've been advising companies is think about these moments that matter. So things that are really crucial and really important, try and do those face-to-face. So instead of thinking about days of the week, which I guess is one kind of approach that some businesses might take, we're going to be in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, and the rest of the time you can do what you like, or whatever the different approaches might be. But instead of thinking about days, think about the activities, thinking about the different work tasks that are important in your organization or in your team, and then define and agree, okay, these are the things that are the moments that matter. So these are the ones that we're going to do face-to-face, and make sure that we have that connection on a reasonably regular basis. So I think that's one thing that's kind of helped people start to kind of think about the right thing, the right way to manage those. Creating social moments, so just making sure that there's plenty of opportunities for people to come together and feel that sense of belonging, and asking the employee group to be doing that rather than that just kind of being defined by an HR team or a management team. But making sure, again, that's kind of bottom up, because otherwise you might end up with all these kind of slightly cheesy or forced social interactions that nobody really wants to be at or do. So trying to give that kind of responsibility to the employee group is always useful. I was going to say the other one we've been talking about is magnetising offices, which I guess is something that's, very close to your heart at Interaction. And that is about making sure that people have a reason to come into the office to see each other. It's not just to see each other. Yes, to see each other is great, but there also needs to be an environment there that can compete with whatever benefits you have in your home and that will actually bring you in. And then once people are in the office, there's a lot of research that says doing stuff together, like eating together and taking breaks together, is really, really valuable for that sense of connection. So don't just work together and then go home. Actually do all those social things as well.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Because we do that interaction. We all eat lunch together at the same sort of shared space. And for new starters and people new to the business, it can feel a bit maybe forced occasionally because they're like maybe not used to it and they're suddenly sitting with lots of people. But within a week or so, they really love it because it is a very different time you get to spend with your colleagues and you talk about different stuff and you form different relationships and you work out different dynamics and stuff. So you might have to force it a bit essentially at the beginning, but those rituals and routines can end up being really like glue, can't they, that holds the culture together. It's really good fun. And in terms of individual resilience as well, I know that's an area you do quite a lot of work into, and it's a word we hear thrown around a lot when it comes to these sort of issues. But what's your understanding of resilience? And I guess another thing that I encountered in some of your writing, which I thought was really interesting, is the idea that resilience is flexible and we can train it and grow it, and it isn't something that's inherent, because you sort of assume that people are resilient or they're not, and they're fragile or they're not. But that's not the case at all, is it? So talk me through that. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Resilience is a kind of hot topic at the moment, but it is something that I've been working in for the last couple of years. So I've kind of grown my knowledge in that area. Yeah, so the research tells us that resilience is not a fixed trait. It's not something we're born with or not. And it's not really a personality trait. Or there are some personality traits that will kind of help you be more resilient, to be fair. So that sense of having a good sense of optimism, and that can be established through life experience and through genetics, and also a sense of openness to new experience can also be helpful for resilience, which is a personality trait. But broadly speaking, the research tells us that you are able to develop resilience. And when you learn that and you realize that, that's when it can become quite powerful, I think. And that's why organizations are thinking, well, how can we help people understand more about what resilience is, and how can we train them and help them improve their resilience, so that when we are going through change or when there's lots of uncertainty or stressful times, which, as we all know, is pretty standard in the workplace and life in general, we can react well and we can cope well. We know the different kind of tools we can use and resources that we have around us to help us manage those tough times.
So what are some of the ways that people can train resilience? How does one grow their personal resilience?
So I think it's all about understanding what the core kind of factors are that build our resilience. So one of the key ones is all around having a good sense of purpose and meaning in life. So if we really understand what we enjoy and what our strengths are, and we make sure that we have high levels of engagement, either in work or in home, or ideally in both of them, then when the chips are down and when things are difficult, we've got lots of different things that we can use to kind of different areas of our life where we can kind of like pull ourselves back up again. So having that sense of purpose and meaning is important. Supportive relationships are really valuable and really important. They really help buffer the negative impact of stress in our lives. So if we've got people that we can be with that kind of instill a sense of belonging, so that kind of tribe thing that we were talking about earlier. Also people that we can share our emotions with and talk about our problems and our fears, and people that can provide practical support as well. So those kind of supportive relationships are really, really crucial for our resilience.
Is there, do you think that's something that organisations can monitor, how resilient their culture is and their people are? Are there signs they can look out for to give them an indicator?
Yeah, you can measure resilience. I mean, there's different tools and techniques that you can use to measure resilience. One of the tools I use actually does measure individual resilience. So, you can use on your online questionnaires or surveys. So individuals can get a good measure of their resilience and understand the different things that feed it. And then organisations at the same time can then get a good understanding of if there's different areas where people perhaps need to improve or need a bit of a boost to the different factors that feed it.
Okay, cool. And then one of the things that people seem to fail at a lot is the last hurdle of creating change, but then embedding that change through an organization. So what are some ways, and I know this is stuff you do some work on embedding change and getting people to change their habits over the long term rather than just a brief blip and then back to business as usual?
Yeah, sure. So within organizations or kind of individually, because there's two different things.
I was thinking organisationally, but I mean, both are sort of overlapping massively, aren't they? So either, really.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, when we're thinking about behaviour change and thinking about individuals, that's obviously something that's challenging for organisations because everybody's different and they're coming to the party with a different set of skills and experiences and kind of interest in the change or otherwise. We talk about there's a model that talks about, it's called the COM-B model. So COM, so stands for capability, opportunity, and motivation. And these are some of the key factors that we need to think about if we want to embed behaviour change. So capability is all about, does that person have the skills and the experience to be able to make that change that they're thinking about making? Opportunity is all about the physical and the social environment to be able to enable the behaviour change that you're looking for. So something that really makes it easy for the individual, enables the individual to make that change. And then the motivation piece is, am I motivated to make that change? Is it going to make me feel good? Is it going to bring some, positive benefits to my life? So that kind of links back to the communication bit that we were talking about earlier and making sure people understand what that change is all about.
So in terms of that communication piece, I think everyone's worked in businesses and organisations that aren't great at communicating and get even worse when times are uncertain. And often the response is, we don't want to communicate because we don't know what's around the corner. We've got nothing to say. We're trying to figure it out. We just won't say anything for a bit. And that never goes down particularly well, does it? But it is sort of understandable from the organisation's perspective because they might be considering redundancies or, and do you communicate? That's one of the options on the table. What are some rules they should live by when trying to think about how to communicate this change down through the business?
Yeah, good question. I think it is a challenging one for organisations. And I think, the mistake that you can make is to think, well, if we don't have anything to say, let's not say anything at all for now. But actually, when you're an employee working, maybe in a junior role or any role, it doesn't matter. If you're not hearing anything, then you will start to fill the gaps with rumour or with hearsay. And that's where the gossip and the rumour mill starts churning. And then you've got a bigger problem on your hands because you've got stuff out there that people are talking about that actually probably isn't true at all. So I think it's really important. And I always advise clients to really think about their communication strategy and really be constantly communicating with their teams and making sure that they're saying something. So they're keeping people updated or they're just repeating the same messages and using different channels and making sure that, because every time you send a communication, you don't know that everyone's going to click on that email and read it, do you? Or really kind of engage with it or really understand it and digest it even. So making sure that you've got lots of different channels which appeal to different people. So, we talk about having, running town halls to communicate a message as well as running focus groups, as well as running, sending an email out. So people have different channels that they can kind of engage with.
So you can't overdo it.
I don't think so, no. What do you think?
No, I'd sort of agree. I think if you overdo it, people disengage with some of that message, which is fine. But if you don't do it at all, people haven't got anything to engage with at all. So they spiral off into all sorts of stuff, don't they? So yeah, it's always funny watching that from the inside, I guess. So talking about overdoing it, I think we're sort of coming to the end of our time. It's been incredible to have you on. Thank you. And I've learned loads on this podcast. It's been great. Where can people go to find out a bit more about you and what you do?
Oh, great. Yeah. So I've got a website, which is www.babelprojects.co.uk. Or you can find me on LinkedIn. It's Jennifer Duckworth. Should be able to find me there as well.
Amazing. Lovely. Thanks so much for coming on, Jen. Take care.
Thanks, Toby. Bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed that. And if you did, please give us a good rating on your platform of choice and be sure to subscribe to future episodes. And while you're doing that, why not follow Interaction on all the usual socials? Thanks, and see you on the next episode.